welcome to Dialogue. China-Japan relations have severely worsened after Japan's new Prime Minister, Sanae Takaichi, said that any conflict in the Taiwan Strait would be a survival-threatening situation for Japan, a legal phrase that opened the door to potential military involvement. Beijing has denounced the remark as a serious breach of the One China principle and a gross interference in its internal affairs. How has the Japanese Prime Minister triggered such a crisis? What does it tell us about Japan's evolving security posture? And where might this confrontation lead? Join us for discussion today from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today are Zhou Bo, Senior Fellow, Center for International Security and Strategy, Tsinghua University. Benoit Hardy-Chartrand, Faculty Lecturer of Political Science and International Affairs, Temple University, Japan, and KJ Noor, journalist, writer, and educator. Welcome to Dialogue. Zhou Bo, I will start with you. Let's take a look at the latest. Takaichi refused to retract her remarks, but she did reiterate the government's position on responding to regional contingencies, namely that for any specific incident, Japan will make a judgment taking into account all relevant information. Again, I repeat, she refused to take back her words. So that means the crisis will continue for a while?
Well, I think so, because, the Chinese side certainly hope she will make an apology, but given that her support rate is still high, so I don't believe that she will just say anything like that, although she has indirectly admitted that this is not appropriate thing for her to say.
Mm-hmm. KJ, what do you make of her stance? She repeated the traditional line, but she, did not repeat these fundamental documents, on the One China principle, which is a key here, which means Taiwan is part of China. There's only one China.
Yes, it's very interesting that she did not acknowledge that. She had some very evasive and I would say dishonest statements, but we have to come back to the fact that these words are incredibly sensitive. These words have legal force. They are illocutionary statements. They're trigger words for war, and they have declarative force under Japanese law, the 2015 legislation passed by Abe. So this is the casus belli cause for expeditionary war, not tied directly to invasion or self-defense for Japan. I've referred to it as the killer cop excuse. In the United States, the police kill on average 3 people every day, and they always say, I felt threatened by the suspect. I had no choice but to shoot them. This is that clause written into Japanese law, and Prime Minister Takaichi has not only invoked it, but tied it directly to Taiwan, which is a sovereign affair, an internal affair of China. That is an extraordinary violation of every agreement and every understanding of international law.
Benoit, if you look at the domestic situation, why is it so hard for Takaichi to say, I'm sorry, I will repeat this, fundamental documents between the two countries about the One China principle?
I think one of the main reasons why Takaichi has not repudiated her statement, has not retracted her statement, is due to various reasons. Well, first of all, she has long, for many years, been a kind of self-declared supporter of Taiwan. It's important to mention here, not Taiwanese independence, but rather a supporter of Taiwan as a whole. She has made many statements over the years, and we're talking about a politician who's been in the Diet for 30 years, right? So there have been repeated statements on her part that were fairly controversial on Taiwan. But of course, making these kinds of comments as a regular Diet member versus as a prime minister entails very different consequences, of course. So I think her statement and her refusal to repudiate these statements is partly due to personal beliefs. She is known to be quite nationalistic and conservative on foreign affairs issue, and possibly as well some of the pressures from inside her party, possibly as well from the coalition partner of the LDP. Because let's remember that previously, until the last election, the LDP's coalition partner, the Komeito, was a more dovish party, a party that had advocated for more stable relations with China. Whereas now the new coalition party of Japan, of the LDP, the Japan Innovation Party, is even more hawkish and conservative in many ways than Takaichi's own party, the LDP. So if you take all of these elements together, that explains, I think, in large part why she has not retracted her statements, and it would be seen, in her view, as a kind of signal of weakness on her part.
Well, Zhou Bo, it seems there's some would say there's a lack of flexibility anyway. But if you look at what she said exactly, she used a phrase like, survival threatening situation. Why such a statement, means a shift or a breach, from their traditional position on the one China principle, but politically and diplomatically, why is it sensitive from the Chinese perspective?
Well, I just give you an example. A few years ago, some rocket shells fell on Chinese territory from Myanmar because the Myanmar government troops were chasing the rebels across the border, right? But China didn't say much because China knew that this shells just fell into Chinese territory accidentally. So, but in this case, we are still separated by the sea, and so is Taiwan separated with Japan by the sea. So even in this kind of situation, she would claim that this kind of situation would be an existential threat to Japan. That actually went too far and invite me to think another question. For example, should there be a situation that there is a conflict in Taiwan Strait? Would the United States, send troops? The U.S. so far has been ambiguous about this, right? And if the United States would not send troops, to Taiwan Strait, would Japan send troops, themselves? So in this case, this is almost like, the tail wagging the dog, because unless there is a situation in which the United States has decided to send troops and Japanese would follow, then there might be a possibility. But in this case, if Prime Minister Takaichi just takes this kind of a situation as an existential threat to Japan, so what is the so-called threat? For the Japanese government, which acknowledge Taiwan being part of China.
Mm-hmm. Well, Benoit, some say, given her background, Takaichi is destined to trigger a crisis with China, probably. And tell us why people say so. Do you agree?
Yes, okay. I understand your question. So, of course, there were some people who were worried before she came to power, given her past stances. And I alluded to some of these past tenses in her 30 years as a member of the Japanese parliament. Many of these statements, as you pointed out yourself, were perceived as being revisionist, being quite hawkish. So there was indeed a worry before she came to power that she would undermine relations with some of the neighbors, especially because in the last few years, relations between Japan and its neighbors had stabilized quite significantly. If you look at the previous Prime Minister Ishiba and the previous Prime Minister before him, Kishida, relations have gotten a lot better with South Korea, for example, and relations with between Japan and China, while I would not call them necessarily positive, they had certainly been stabilizing over the past year or so. The momentum was relatively positive. I have to admit that I did not expect that this first crisis would happen as quickly within her first month of being in office.
Well, Kwiji, of course, one understanding is like some Japanese politicians also say she need to be careful it's like she's having a gaffe instead of the shift of the policy on the one China principle. But from Chinese point of view, this is, as you said, salami slicing. Every time you move a little bit, away from the one China principle, in terms of respecting that as the Chinese affairs. And that plus, of course, who she is. She advocates, for example, the reinterpretation of Japanese history along nationalistic lines. She's a regular visit to the controversial Yasukuni Shrine, where also Class A war criminals were there. And she criticized in previous official Japanese statements, such as Murayama and Kono statements, which offered apologies for Japan's wartime atrocities. And she talked about building Japan into a military power by accelerating the country's defense build-up. And of course, on one hand, people say, they want to make Japan a normal country, to increase the defense military capability. Probably no big deal. But for neighbors like China, like South Korea, with this painful history, and we are naturally sensitive to that development. And of course, she's very hawkish. She didn't, sort of like living in denial of what happened in history.
Yes, I think the denialism is extraordinary. She's an extraordinary revisionist. As you pointed out, she has visited Yasukuni Shrine on a regular basis. And for those who don't understand what Yasukuni Shrine is, this would be as if, the German PM Merz was visiting and honoring, Hitler. If Hitler were buried somewhere, that it would be like going there and paying respects to Hitler. It would be unthinkable. But the LDP, especially, Shinzo Abe's Seiwa faction, they routinely did this. And so when they talk about Japan becoming a normal country, what they're really thinking about is Japan recovering its status as, the imperial military power of Asia. And I think that it's very, very important to point out that, yes, this is true. She's saying that this is simply this is their standard policy. But actually, what she has done is she has said the quiet part out loud, which is that they are moving towards remilitarization. They're unrepentant militarists and revisionists. And I remind people that Shinzo Abe, for example, he went onto a plane, a jet fighter, and the jet fighter had the letters 731 written on it. That was very deliberate. Japanese fighters usually have 5, 4, or sometimes 6 numbers, but this one had 3 numbers, 731, which of course is a direct reference to the medical experimentation unit that conducted human experimentation, human medical testing. This is one of the most extraordinarily atrocious events that happened in the 20th century. And they were flaunting this in this brazen manner. So this is the way that the Prime Minister thinks. She is clearly well mentored by Shinzo Abe. And I would say that this language is deliberate, provocative, and clearly hawkish and unrepentant. And I think that anybody who thinks otherwise is, I think, not paying attention.
Mm-hmm. Well, Zhou Bo, I'm thinking of right-wing politicians. Say Takaichi is not alone in the sense. If you look at the global stage, for example, in European countries, you have a right-wing politician in France, in Germany, in Netherlands, other parts of European Union. But in general, people are very sensitive on that issue. Either you take measures basically to restrict their access to or the possibility of becoming a part of the government, or they are being shunned by the mainstream politics there. But why Japan, instead of saying no to these right-wing, ultra-conservative politicians, she became the prime minister. what does that say to probably the Japanese politics?
Well, I think you have made a point to point out that actually populism is rampant now in Europe. But comparatively speaking, yeah, I think in Europe, people still would regard against certain things. But in Japan, I think part of the reason is because immediately after the war, Japan's atrocities and things were not actually cleaned, because the emperor, is still there, and that has something to do with the United States. Yeah, so the political system is still very much maintained. So a lot of criminals were judged, but still there are some other people, like the Indian judge would insist that okay, these people are simply innocent. So I think there's this kind of understanding, lesson learned from history, are not thoroughly studied in Japan as they were done in Europe. That certainly was the case. And then, of course, as other panelists have pointed out, this actually is a kind of salami slicing. It just starts to snowball, because without a reflection on these kind of things, the root causes, and with the changing situation, politician would just make use of the changing situation to add things here and there, and eventually moving toward the goal of becoming more and more militarized.
Benoit, tell us more about this Japanese society, or in general, where you have they produce this political figure, and then which became the prime minister of the country, and the LDP has a small partner party which is even more nationalistic. Somehow, being nationalistic is popular in this country. Is that a sign that the whole society probably somehow is turning to the right?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, because I'm always interested in looking at how Japanese people, public opinion, feel about these things. I've been living in this country, after all, for 10 years, and I've always studied or looked at closely at the evolution of Japanese public opinion, their views on the political situation, not only in Japan, but in the region as well. Now, if you look at the most recent political situation, the most recent elections, there are certain results there that could certainly lead us to believe that there has been a bit of a shift to the right in the voting patterns in Japanese society. A smaller party that is quite right-wing and anti-immigration won 15 seats in the previous election last August, which was seen as a bit of an indication of a shift in Japanese society. However, overall, when it comes to nationalism, I don't think we can see a very large shift or necessarily a big support for any kind of, I would say, return to the past or return to imperial Japan. There's no indication of this happening. In fact, if you look at certain surveys, while Japanese people do see, for example, the reinforcement of Japanese capabilities as something that they generally support, given that they feel that the regional environment, regional geopolitical environment is a little bit more tense in the region. Overall, looking at these same surveys, we can see that, for example, the number of Japanese people who would be willing to go to war or who would be willing to take up arms if Japan was in a war still remains quite low, and in fact quite lower than neighboring countries. So when it comes to this kind of sense of ultra hawkish nationalism within Japanese society, is not something that we are seeing. But certainly, looking at the leaders, it's understandable how people in other countries might have different impressions. But that's why I think it's important to understand really how Japanese people view the situation. But I don't think we're looking here at a major departure from Japanese society and politics. It's more of an evolution, slow evolutions in the last 10, 15 years.
If you look at it domestically, of course, Zhou Bo, there are some criticism of the prime minister's rhetoric and her refusal to walk back from her rhetoric there. Some say, for example, the former Prime Minister Ishiba said that stability in the relationship with China is very important to Japan, and Japanese government of the past has been respecting this one China principle. Taiwan is part of China, and that's a traditional policy. That's the political foundation for the relationship between the two countries. Do you think criticism like this will be creating pressure enough for Takaichi to retract her remarks?
No, I don't think so. I think she has already learned the lesson, but it would be difficult for her as a prime minister to openly make an apology. But I believe the pressure coming from neighboring countries would still work, in that this kind of criticism will set a precedence, and for the prime ministers in Japan to come up to observe certain kind of rules. Yeah. And it is certainly inappropriate for the Japanese prime minister to say anything like that. So I believe this kind of strong reaction and protest from China would still work. It may not work that well on her, because as I mentioned earlier, her popularity is still high, not necessarily because of this. So, but it will just work on the Japanese prime ministers to come. Yeah, this kind of response will set a precedent itself.
Mm-hmm. But tell us more on that, Zhou Bo. Why setting a precedent is important for China? My own observation is like, some even in the West, they talk about the UN resolution on Taiwan. They say, no, the resolution does not talk about this one China principle, didn't talk about Taiwan, things like that, it's a kind of signal to support the secessionist forces in Taiwan. I mean, that's a Chinese concern. Is there a possibility, is there a danger that if China, stay calm and does nothing and let her pass, and some other countries will, probably go further to challenge the Chinese one China principle?
Well, you see, one China principle is really a big basket. Yeah, a lot of countries would just put everything in it. And while they are actually changing the content, they still would say, one China. For example, Joe Biden, got 4 times on this one China principle, but eventually his aides, his advisor would still say that we're still, upholding this one China principle. So this is a big basket, but what in the basket might change from time to time. I think when I heard Prime Minister Takaichi talking about this kind of existential threat, for the first time I started to think about this possibility of whether China and Japan would come into a direct conflict. Yeah, I never thought about this, because even with this Senkaku Island issue, I don't believe a kind of a war situation is possible between us. But in this situation, when she's so straightforward about this kind of situation, I start to think about that, and that is why this has worried some Japanese politicians who start to criticize her, because in what's the scenario of a conflict between China and Japan, there is no possibility whatsoever for Japan to win over China. So why then would you be so provocative in the sovereignty of another country?
Interesting. Of course, China has done some measures quickly there. For example, in terms of the tourists, in terms of overseas students to Japan, but nobody is confident enough that that will work on Takaichi to walk back her remarks and repeat this one China principle, which she has refused so far. And China has referenced this enemy state clause in the UN. Another measure taken by China. The Chinese side noted that the clause allows the victors in World War II, that includes China, to take military measures against any former Axis powers chiefly Germany, Italy, and Japan, should they pursue aggressive policies? You don't need to require a prior UN security authorization. How do you look at the Chinese move? I mean, how do you think the Chinese side views that, as a serious matter?
I think it heightens or emphasizes how important and serious this is. Once again, we have to understand the term that the Prime Minister was using, survival threatening situations, sonritsu kikijitai, is the term that the Japan used in 1894, in 1931, in 1937, in 1941. Each time that it has gone to war, it has used that term. And as I have also said, that it is also the legal justification, it's a casus belli language that justifies expeditionary war. It is an extraordinary breach of any notion of Japan and China's understood agreements and normalization. And therefore, it's completely understandable that China is taking strong measures to express its displeasure and to send the message to Japan that we will not be having relations, or we will not be funding you if your plan is to go to war with us. Once again, Japan has been a wicked actor in Asia. And I think it's incumbent on China to send a message strongly to this extraordinarily hawkish faction of the LDP that any further salami slicing will not be tolerated. Remember, the United Nations was created so that we would not have a repeat of what happened in World War II, where, for example, Japan genocided 35 million Chinese and enslaved millions in Manchurian Liaoning province. So when Japan talks war, everybody should pay attention. We've been down this road before. I don't think anybody wants war. I agree that the Japanese people don't want war, but the Japanese leadership, along with the US leadership, seem to be very, very much on that hawkish path.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Thank you for joining us. With that, we come to the end for today's discussion. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Jindor. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.